As I mentioned before, we will be working on 3 finishing techniques after we've sawed out our saw piercing. The first finishing technique, of course, was filing, where we took a needle file and filed the edges so that they were smooth and that they're rounded. So before you begin the second finishing technique, which is what we'll talk about today, just double check all of your edges. Feel it with your fingers, make sure that it's really smooth. If you feel any rough areas, just take the file and go over it lightly until it feels smooth. So now we'll move on to sanding. And if we take a look at the surface of the metal, we'll see a lot of big scratches on the metal itself. This is probably from the file. It might also be from having the metal on the table where there's a lot of grooves and lines. So we're going to use sandpaper to sand out the surface so that it has more of a finished look to it. So sandpaper is just paper with a gritty sand-like substance on it that allows you to put scratches on the surface of whatever it is that you're sanding, whether it's wood or it's metal. There are different numbers associated with sandpaper. We always start with the roughest sandpaper, which will make very large scratches that are far apart from each other on the metal, and then we work to a more fine grit sandpaper so that the scratches are closer together and less noticeable as scratches. So the sandpaper that we use is in a container like this. It's labeled for which sandpaper is which. There's 320, there's 400, and there is 600. So again, we start with 320, which is the grittiest. And you can feel it if you put your finger on the sandpaper. Then we move to 400 grit, and then we finally end with 600 grit, which is the finest sandpaper. So what I'm going to do is get 3 pieces of sandpaper. I've got 320, and they should be labeled on the back also. 400 and 600. And if you put your fingers on it, you can feel the difference. The 320 is definitely the grittiest. The 400 is in between, and the 600 is the smoothest or finest. When you sand, you're going to sand on a piece of paper. So you can use a piece of sketchbook paper. Just do not sand on the table, as you'll pick up more scratches on the back of the metal, the side that you're not sanding. So make sure that you're working on a nice smooth surface. So what I'm going to do is take my sandpaper, and I'm going to start with the grittiest. I'm going to hold my metal like this on the paper, and I'm going to use my thumb to push away. So I'm gripping the sandpaper, and I'm going to push away, and I'm going to create scratches with the sandpaper. And as I press harder and harder and sand more, all these random deep scratches will begin to disappear as I sand down the metal. So what we want to do, so if this is my saw piercing and I've got all these random scratches, we want to sand so that we have all the sanding lines going in the same direction. So we're going to sand over like that. So we don't want to sand in a circle so it makes sand lines like that, because that looks very messy on the surface. So we're going to keep it all going in the same direction. So I could go like this. I could make my sand lines all go across like this. Just keep them straight and keep them all in the same direction. So I'm going to hold on to it like this, and I'm going to use my thumb to press. And to get those large deep scratches from the file and from the table off, I am going to have to put quite a bit of pressure on the metal. So I'm pressing very hard. And if you take a look at the surface up close, you can see that the top surface of copper is being scratched away, and you can see the lines made by the sandpaper. And you can still see some of the deep scratches, so I need to work more on those areas. And they're starting to come out. So depending on how deep your scratches are, you may have to sand more or less. And it is important that you make sure that you have a hole and the hole is filed down before you begin sanding. If you go through the entire process of sanding and realize that you never asked for a hole, then you're going to have to go through the entire sanding process over again. Because when I use the drill press, it will put some scratches on the metal. So now I'm going to get the neck of the dog. So I flipped it over and I'm going in the same direction. And if you feel like your sandpaper is becoming worn out and you use the entire area, they don't last forever, so you may need to throw away the paper and get a new piece if you need more of the grit if it's worn down. So I still got a few scratches right underneath the hole. There's a scratch that I'm working at. It is important also that you get the edges so we don't leave those unfinished. You can kind of just go back and forth on the edge like this. So once you have 320 complete, you're then going to move to 400. And you'll notice that the lines get even finer and closer together. And of course you'll get the edges. And you can see a lot of copper dust building up. That's another reason why you work on your sketchbook paper. And it does get on your hands quite a bit too, so you'll need to wash your hands afterwards. Try not to touch your face. So once you change sandpapers and use another sandpaper, you should definitely see a change in the surface. It should get brighter and shinier. The lines should get closer together until you finish with 600. I'm going to move this around a little bit so I'm not keeping the metal in that copper dusted area. So now what I'll do is take a second, and I do need to do the edges. I'm going to flip it over, so this is the sanded side and this is the unsanded side. So you can see the difference. This side is definitely brighter, looks a little more finished. Once you're finished with sanding, we do not want to get this metal scratched, so you shouldn't just throw it in your bin. I'm going to give you a little baggie to put it in to keep it safe from being scratched. So after you're done sanding, make sure that you ask me for a baggie to put your metal in, and then we'll move to the third finishing technique, which is going to be buffing. So we worked on sanding today, and then we will work on buffing last.